Well, I think now that you have mentioned specifically Mr. Camping, why don't you tell us a brief history, a summarized history of Mr. Camping and how he founded Family Radio and how the network rose to the position of prominence in the Christian church as it had done, especially amongst Reformed Christians, that remained as a favorite and a bulwark of the truth until approximately 1993 or so. But if you could tell us about this story.
Sure. Be glad to. Yeah, Family Radio was formed actually as a nonprofit ministry in 1958 and went on the air. Its first FM station back when AM was, FMs were not well known. The FM frequency was not well known amongst people, radio listeners. AM was the dominant. But Family Radio went on the air on February 4th, 1959, in a once FM station here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so over the course of the next 40 years, Family Radio had a pretty broad lineup of a lot of different teachers and music. Increasingly became well known. It was sort of in many circles, Family Radio was a pioneer because we began as a listener-supported ministry entirely, and that was somewhat unusual back in that day. And even today, it's still rare. Today, Family Radio is still entirely listener-supported, but at the time, it was very unusual. So Family Radio began to grow. When I started in 1987, there were 8 stations throughout the U.S., 8 major stations, New York, Los Angeles, San Diego. Then the next, in the 90s and the early 2000s, mid-2000s, Family Radio grew to 66 stations, and I think almost 100 translators throughout the, so it was a pretty large network. But things began to change, like you mentioned, in 1992. Mr. Camping gathered the staff here at Family Radio and told the staff that he had written a book entitled 1994, and then it had a question mark. And there was some dispute about that, but Mr. Camping, from 92 to 94, began to actively talk about the end of the world possibly occurring. In fact, he said at one point, 99 and 9/10% sure that it was going to happen in September of 1994. Well, that came and went, and Family Radio went through a transition in the 90s. In fact, Mr. Camping had in 96, he had bypass surgery, but things began to quiet, and listeners began to return to Family Radio. And then right around 2000, Mr. Camping came out with his End of the Church Age doctrine. He became convinced in his study of the book of Acts and the book of John, and he publicly began to announce on Open Forum and his Family Bible Study that indeed God had left the churches, or God's, the Holy Spirit. So that began and launched, Family. That drove a wedge, obviously, with the churches. That created a tremendous amount of contention. And then you have, beginning in 2006, Mr. Camping actively came out with the 2011 prediction, and that started slow until Mr. Camping had an interview with a San Francisco news reporter who published his prediction, and that sort of launched the secular. Actually, Mr. Camping always said, I'm not going to rely on the church at all. The church is not going to spread this news, but rather I'm going to rely on the secular newspapers and media organizations to spread the word about the end of the world, May 21. Actually, at the time, it was October 21, 2011.
Just to go back in time a little bit, so people have more of an idea of who Harold Camping was. He was a Christian Reformed Church elder, correct?
Yes.
And he was he an architect? Tell me something about where he was involved in the construction field or the architectural field.
Sure. He was an engineer.
Engineer, right.
Engineer by training, yep. And he had started his own business after World War II. He had his own business, camping construction. He built, in fact, he specialized in building churches. He, at the time, was very much involved as a layman. In fact, I think he was one of very few laymen that were invited to the synod. They had their annual synod, the Christian Reformed Church. And he was very active. He was a very active member of the Christian Reformed denomination until his departure in 1988.
And he departed in 88 for what reason? Because I know a lot of pastors departed the Christian Reformed Church over liberalism. Not that the pastors that left were liberal, but that the denomination was increasingly becoming more liberal.
No, it wasn't for that reason. Well, I mean, I think that was a contributing factor, but the consistory had asked Mr. Camping to step down briefly for a period of time as a teaching elder, and he refused to do that. So he said, "No, I'm a teacher. I'm going to go, and I'm going to start." And basically, he started his own church.
Oh, so that's what he did, and that was an independent church.
Yeah, it was called the Bible Reformed Church of Alameda, or Reformed Bible Church of Alameda. In 1988, probably took a couple of years because he tried to find. And I remember we tried to find a pastor who would be willing to come. Because already then he was beginning to question the three forms of unity, the
right.
canons of Dort and some of the confessions, and that gave a lot of pastors pause, and they were not willing to align themselves already then with Mr. Camping because, and this was in 87. This was probably 1989.
And what were the specific reasons that the CRC gave for wanting him to step down from his position as elder back then? This is before the predictions of the end of the world, before the end of the church age teaching. What were the specific reasons they gave that you know of anyway?
Well, I don't know specifically. I wasn't in those meetings with the three.
Well, it is.
But
Harold Camping, from my memory, has always been an anomaly amongst Reformed people because he always struck me, as long as I was aware of him, and I had met him on several occasions at conferences, but he was an anomaly in that he seemed to be anti-confessional in a very confessional in very confessional circles of fellowship, if you will. I remember him clearly wearing the button, the Bible alone or the Bible only. And of course, we who are Reformed, as I know you would agree, we are staunch adherents to the Reformation pillar sola scriptura, but that does not mean that we only read our Bibles and never glean from the wisdom and brilliance of other Christians, not only from our own day, but from centuries past. And that would include the confessions, which are really summaries of biblical teaching. He always struck me as a bit out of step because of what appeared to be an anti-confessionalism. Was I correct in assuming that?
I mean, I don't know Mr. Camping's heart. I do know that his personality was such that, when he was thinking, as he ran his business, he was trying to decide, well, what do I do with my life? And he thought about going to seminary. So he said, rather than go to seminary, I'm just going to teach myself. And he began to go. There was a at Berkeley on the adjunct campus. There was I can't remember the name of it, but there was a seminary there, a school of theology that was connected to UC Berkeley. And he began to go to, they had a pretty extensive library, and he began, he got permission and went there and started studying some of the confessions as well as some of the historical things. But Mr. Camping himself, I mean, I don't know him well enough to know what prompted him to begin to question the synodical or the confessions, other than he just felt that the Bible had to be supreme. And some of the confessions I think he felt became more important to denominations than the actual Bible itself.